as established in 1948 on 78% of historic Palestine, at the expense of 700,000 people who were driven, indigenous Palestinians who were driven out. But this nevertheless became the legal entity of Israel as recognized by the international community and the United Nations. The parts that you see in red are the occupied territories. They make up about 22% of the entire territory. And these are the parts that Israel had taken over in 1967. Now, Israel's takeover of those territories in 1967 was immediately ruled illegal by the United Nations, as it is a standard principle of international law that land cannot be acquired by force. And so, Resolution 242 was issued calling on Israel to immediately withdraw. And there really is a very basic solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There has been a practical solution on the table for the past 20 years. And that has to do with Israel withdrawing from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state, and Israel would keep 78% of the entire land. Now, the Palestinians have accepted this in 1988, unilaterally renouncing any Palestinian right to Israel proper. And the idea was that this was going to kick off the peace process by which Israel was going to gradually withdraw from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state. The only problem is that during the peace process, Israel was doing the exact opposite. Instead of withdrawing from the occupied territories, Israel was actually expanding into the occupied territories and had doubled the number of illegal settlements that it had built in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So every red dot that you see up there within the West Bank is an illegal Israeli settlement. They're illegal basically under Resolution 446, which passed the UN Security Council, and under the Geneva Conventions. And here's where the problem with the wall comes in. The wall is illegal because of the route that it takes, not because anybody is opposed to security of any sort. So had the wall been built on the border between the West Bank and Israel, then nobody would have objected to it. But it is specifically because the wall goes deep into the Palestinian territories, annexing major Israeli settlements, all the major water resources in the West Bank, and excluding Palestinians from all of Jerusalem, including all of those on the Israeli side of the border. This is why the wall was ruled illegal, and this is why it has to go down. Like Mexico and the US or anywhere else, any country, every country has the right to build a wall or a fence or a barrier of any sort, so long as you build it on your border. To bring this down more to a simple, more mundane example, if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you're free to put up a fence between your backyard and his. But if your fence that you put up goes around his swimming pool and includes it in your backyard, then the reason why you built the fence becomes more transparent. Then it becomes obvious that the fence was not built so it could separate you from your neighbor, but so that it could include your neighbor's swimming pool on your side of the, on basically into your backyard. Now, there is speculation over whether the wall, basically has actually worked in securing Israel. There are alternative explanations to why the violence had gone down. One would being the fact that the Intifada had essentially died down during that period. A second is that Hamas had declared a unilateral ceasefire in August of 2004, which lasted until mid-2006. And then, but throwing away these explanations, suppose that the wall did actually, was the reason why attacks against Israelis had diminished. What does that tell us? I mean, for example, if you take some random city and say crime was particularly high among a particular demographic, and if you grabbed everybody who belongs to that particular ethnic group and threw them in jail, would crime go down? My suspicion is it might. But is that an ethical or a justified action to take? The answer is of course not. So even if the wall does work, the fact that it's on Palestinian territory and designed to basically cage in Palestinians to make sure they don't commit atrocities against Israelis, then it is by definition a monstrous measure. I think the much more reasonable solution would be to end the occupation completely so that there would not be any need for a wall. And if supposedly ending the occupation does not solve the issue, then Israel is free to build a wall so long as it builds it on its own border between it and the occupied territories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that we received from a student is this. Israel says that it must have security before political change can occur. The The Palestinians say that political change must occur in order for there to be security. How can these two legitimate desires be reconciled? If a couple of you want to speak to that and just keep it brief.
Could you say that a little bit louder?
Oh.
I can't hear. It's hard to hear.
Israel says that it must have security before political change can occur. The Palestinians say that political change must occur in order for there to be security. How can these desires be reconciled?
I'm sorry. It's a tough question. There's no easy answers to settling this dispute. So I wish all of us here had a magic wand to suddenly erase the tragedy that's been going on. The fact of the matter, Israel has started to make political change and agreed to that. We see what happened. Israel withdrew from Gaza, so there's no longer any Israeli presence in Gaza. And what happens? Thousands of rockets are flying across the border. Palestinians then go to the polls and elect Hamas. Now, my fellow panelists said there's a Palestinian Authority or Palestinians accepted no claim to Israel proper. Well, they elected Hamas, who wants to destroy all of Israel and create a Muslim state in its place. So we need to look at that full context. Now, as I said, at Camp David in 2000, Israel offered to withdraw for more than, actually at Todd, Israel offered to withdraw for more than 95% of the disputed territories. Now, I'm not saying it was a perfect plan. Definitely areas for disagreement. But instead of coming back with a counteroffer, the Palestinian Authority walked away and kept escalating the violence. So there's been an effort on the Israeli part to accept a two-state solution, to work towards peace, but the terrorism, the rocket attacks, the incitement that goes on from mosques and in Palestinian schools and on Palestinian TV where Mickey Mouse clone is used to incite violence, that has to be the first step. That incitement and acceptance of Israel's presence as a Jewish state has to come first.
Just a couple of things. First, on the Camp David negotiations in 2000, nothing even close to a viable Palestinian state was offered. And there is very simple evidence. I know there's dispute over the details, but I'll give you a simple example. The foreign minister of Israel at the time, Shlomo Ben Ami, wrote in his book that had he been Palestinian, he would not have accepted the 2000 Camp David offer because it was absurd. So I think that's enough for us to basically recognize the fact that it was not a serious offer. Now, there were negotiations that were more serious that followed the Camp David Accords. Those were the Taba negotiations, which basically were occurring as the violence was going on. And those did come close to a solution, but they were canceled when Barak, the prime minister of Israel at the time, aborted them out of fear that basically he was under too much pressure from the Israeli right wing, of basically selling Israel out by agreeing to concede too much of the occupied territories. And just to touch on the Gaza Strip and the election of Hamas, again, there was a Palestinian Authority pre-Hamas that did accept Israel's right to exist. We've had basically Fatah in power for so long. And during that entire period, Israel's expansion throughout the occupied territories continued. Now, my co-panelist here said that the occupation of Gaza had ended, essentially, Israel withdrew. Now, a couple of things to touch on this. First of all, the occupation of Gaza did not end because Israel still controls the entire Strip, carries regular bombings in there, has been condemned by virtually every human rights organization for the bombings of residential areas in the Gaza Strip. So to suggest that just because the settlers left, that the occupation had ended is inaccurate. And it's also worth noting that when Israel withdrew 8,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip, during the same period, they sent 12,000 settlers more into the West Bank. So, in fact, the occupation was expanding. It was redistributing a little bit, but it was actually, in fact, expanding.
Can I briefly?
Yes.
One thing when I hear this, I begin to wonder, and I think of an ideal world. What you would really like is Israel, which should be able to have an Arab population that lives there in security and without fear. And you have a Palestinian state where if there was some Jews who wanted to live there and live there without fear. And what you see is every time there's a move to allow the Palestinians to have their state, the Jews have to leave. And the reason why is because they're not safe to stay. Versus the Arab population, which has been there since 1948, Arab Israelis, who have been able to live in security in Israel. And so I think that as a backdrop, when you're approaching this situation, it's there's many different root causes. And I think we all come to root causes, but there's some roots that are much, much deeper.
I just want to make a minor, basically, distinction here between Israeli settlers and Palestinian Arabs who live within Israel. Arabs who live within Israel acknowledge that they're in Israel. Settlers who live in the West